This is no longer a time just for words, but for action. A time when empty words are worse than no words at all. We've talked a good talk, but now it's time to walk the walk. To run the race laid out before us. Not for us, but for those behind. Those watching us. They watch to see our hands in action. Our feet firmly planted, taking steps towards the goal. To take the wisdom from those before us and share it with those who will fill our shoes. To show them how to walk the hard path. Guiding and training to prepare for the trials to come. We've been tasked to forge ahead, to be a guide for this journey, to pass the map so they can surpass us. This is disciple life. What will you pass along?
Good morning. So what are you passing along to the next generation? What are you regifting? We are concluding a sermon series today called Regifting, where we've learned how we are regifting some of the great gifts that God has given to us. We've talked about identity and belonging and spiritual gifts and unity in the church. And today we're talking about regifting the gift of faithful management of money. A very practical teaching today. What I'm calling sacred stewardship. Regifting sacred stewardship. I got to be honest, I'm leaning on another pastor a lot in this sermon. A guy named Chip Ingram, who's actually a Gehanna guy. Grew up, he's in the Hall of Fame at Gehanna High School. And he's a pastor that has a national reach in his ministry. And so if you want to hear his two sermons, which I'll tell you are better than mine, on your sermon outline, which I'd encourage you all to get out right now because it's a teaching sermon today, you can see a link to Chip's two sermons, and you can follow the way to listen to those. I also want to say something about next generation. We've been talking about next generation, and certainly that means our children and students and young adults. But it means also anyone of whatever age who's not yet received whatever the gift we're talking about. So you could be 60 years old, and if you've not received the gift that we're talking about regifting, you're part of the next generation. So where would you put yourself when it comes to the management, the faithful management of money, a sacred stewardship? Were you taught how to do that? Did you learn it somewhere along the way? Or maybe you're saying, no, my money's a mess. I need to learn. So regardless of what age you are, and I've heard people in their 60s, 70s saying that, you're part of the next generation that we are regifting today. Because if statistics are true, in this room today, between 40 and 70% of us would say that we are experiencing financial uncertainty in our lives. We may also be people who are saying, I'm under some crushing debt. It's debilitating. That's often what is reported by young adults who are suffering from anxiety and depression, which is growing in our culture. And one of the factors they often cite is their uncertainty over their finances, the crushing debt they're under. We are told by those who study such things and keep track of things that in 50% of divorces, money was one of the factors. The Apostle Paul just cut right to the chase. When he wrote a letter to a next generation young adult that he was mentoring, that he was regifting, a guy named Timothy, he simply said it this way: The love of money, that is, the clinging to of money, is the root of all kinds of evil. Money problems are often the root, yes, of greed and envy and debt, but also of things like workaholism and pride and conflict and anger and guilt and, frankly, just a lack of contentment and peace in life. This is why Jesus talked about money more than anything else. If you take all the words of Jesus and all the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament and you put them in categories, columns according to the topic, money is the most frequent thing he talked about, even more than faith. Why? Because Jesus knew and he taught that money is the chief competitor, the number one competitor for God in our lives. So he said this, where your treasure is, there's your heart also. He says there's a direct connection between what you treasure and where your heart is. Jesus also said this, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You see what Jesus is saying here? He says, we have two masters here, neither of which are going to compromise for us. You cannot think, Jesus is saying, well, I can serve God and I can also serve my money or my wealth. It won't work that way. It's 100% one or the other, which is hard to hear, but that's what Jesus is saying. So let me ask you this right now. How you feeling so far? How you feeling in this sermon? I know sometimes when a pastor gets up and says, hey, we're going to talk about money today, instantly the emotions start rising. I don't like it when they talk about money. Churches talk about money too much, even though Jesus talked about it more than anything else. If that's where you're at, if there's some emotion rising up inside of you, maybe some resistance to this, it's kind of proving this point, frankly, what Jesus said. It's kind of proving it. Our money, dear ones, is always a faith issue. Always. Do we trust God enough to provide? Do we trust God enough to provide? So today, if you're kind of in that category of the next generation in this, you're just like, yeah, my money's a mess, or at least my management of money is not where I would like it to be. Today can be the day where that begins to change, when we all learn this great truth. Your life is a sacred stewardship. Your life, all of our lives, is a sacred stewardship. I want you to repeat after me. My life is a sacred stewardship. Carry that away from today's sermon today. And once you have it, regift it to the next generation, those you have influence over with that don't have this gift yet. One of the places that Jesus taught that our life is a sacred stewardship is in this dramatic parable recorded in Matthew 25. It begins this way. The kingdom of heaven will be like a man, that's God, or I think more particularly here, God the Son, Jesus, like Jesus going on a journey. That's when Jesus ascended to heaven, who called his servants. His servants is anyone who trusts in Jesus, who follows Jesus, and entrusts his wealth to them. Now let's get into this teaching. At the beginning of this parable, where are the servants? Are they outside the master's house or inside the master's house? Inside. They're inside. They're in the family. That's grace, you see. That's where we are when we trust in Jesus. Regardless of what we do or don't do with our money, with our life, we're in. It's not dependent on our behavior. This is what separates Christianity from every other belief system on the planet. In every other belief system, you have to get to a certain point of whatever the good behavior is to get in, to be included, to get the good stuff after you die. Not with Christianity, not with our following Jesus because it's what Jesus did, not what we did. We just trust in what he has done. And that's grace. We're saved by grace through faith alone. And that's such an important foundation to have here when we talk about our money, because we can so quickly be feeling guilty or shame or anger or bitterness about this whole thing because money can be so important to us. Understand, you begin as a follower of Jesus in the house, in the faith. Now it says, he entrusted his wealth to them. His wealth means this: God owns everything. I mean, everything. Certainly your money, but not just your money. Your time, your talents, all that you have. Everything. God owns it all. You don't own it. You may think, well, I worked for it, and I then paid for it with my own money. It's mine. It's not. It's God's. It's all God's. But then Jesus says this. This is the crazy, dramatic part. God owns everything, and he entrusts it to us. That's why it's a sacred stewardship. You see, God owns it. It's sacred. And he entrusts it to us. It's stewardship. It's not sacred ownership. We don't have a sacred ownership because God owns it. But he entrusts it to us. He gives it to us to steward, to manage in a faithful way. We call it stewardship. So everything we have, all of our wealth, all of our possessions, all of our time, all of our talents, our whole life is God's, and he entrusts it all to us. Now, what does it mean by it here? Entrust it. What are we talking about? Now, when it says that the master entrusted his wealth to his servants, you might think, well, that's everything, right? That's like the whole universe. So does that mean like Mark Howard is entrusted with the whole universe? I don't know if he'd want that job. Maybe he would. I don't think it means that, because later on in the parable, when he kind of does, and we'll get to this part, he says, you've been faithful over little, I'll put you in charge over much. So there's obviously not everything. Each of us is not in charge or entrusted with the whole universe, but we are entrusted with it. What is it? It's pretty significant. In the parable, the master gives to 3 servants 5, it says bags of gold. That's not a really helpful translation, by the way. We're trying to make this real. I'm going to make it better, I think, here in a moment. The word is talent. That's the word. 5 talents, to another 2 talents, and to another 1. Do you know how much a talent was worth back in the day of Jesus? A talent was a lot of money. It equaled what a day laborer would earn for their entire working life. Their whole gross salary wage for their whole working life. So I went online. I said, what is the average yearly income for a day laborer in Columbus, Ohio? It's $30,000. Multiply that by 40 years of work, to 1 talent, that equals $1.2 million. To the 2 talents, $2.4 million. And for your accountant, 5 talents is $6 million. That's what we're talking about, the amount of money. But it's more than even that. Jesus uses these extraordinary sums. And if you'd been sitting there listening to this, you'd go like, whoa, that's crazy to give that amount of money away in trust to your servants. Jesus is making the point, it's not just your money, it's your whole life. It's every day that you live. It's what you do with your time, how you develop your gifts and talents. Yes, and your money. It's your whole life that I'm giving to you. You see, this is what's important for you if you're part of the next generation or you need to pass on to the next generation. When someone comes to understand that everything they have belongs to God, it's not theirs, but it's entrusted to them, it changes their whole way of thinking about money and management of money. And it's the next to that we're saved by grace, it's the next foundation stone you put in place when you're teaching about sacred stewardship. So the parable goes on. The master gives 5 talents to one, 2 to another, 1 to another, and then he goes away for a long time. And then it says this. After a long time, the master of the servants returned and settled accounts with them. What does that mean? If there's a soundtrack, you'd imagine right now go, dun-dun-dun-dun. What does it mean, settle accounts? It sounds a little foreboding. Well, it's not really. We know what happens. The one that has 5, gives a report. Says, you gave me 5. There's been 5 more that's earned. Here's 10. To the 2, I had 2. Now I have 4. Here it is. And then to the 1, he says, I buried it. Here it is. This is yours. I'm giving it back to you. Seems like, okay. Why? By the way, let's kind of speculate here. Why do you think the 1 did that? Why did he hide it? What was the emotion that was driving him, do you think? Fear. In fact, he says, I was afraid. You see, he says in his own words, I see you, master, which he's talking about God, by the way. God, I see you as a hard man. You're a hard man. You're a hard task. Here's a guy, if we put in our context, here's someone who sees God as this kind of vengeful, judgmental, hard person. And then in a crazy irony, he says, because I know that you're a person, now listen to this, he says, I know you're a hard man who reaps where you do not sow, gathers where you do not scatter seed. What's he talking about? Every other parable, when Jesus talks about the master, the farmer scattering seed and reaping, what's he talking about? He's talking about people coming to faith and being saved. About gathering all of us into eternal life. And here's this guy that's so confused, just doesn't understand who God really is, that God is a God of grace and love. He thinks this is a bad thing, that you're going to gather where you haven't even scattered seed. You're going to reap where you haven't even sowed. It's talking about how amazing God's grace is. And yet he just doesn't get it. So that's why he's where he's at. Motivated by fear. Well, to the first 2 servants, the master replied this. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. What we learn here is this, that God owns everything, our whole lives, and entrusts it to us to steward for a sacred stewardship. And God works through that to produce fruit, to produce a yield, to produce results that serve his purpose and his priorities, that advance his kingdom. That God wants us to use all that he's given us, our time, our talent, our treasure, to align our hearts and lives with his priorities and advance his kingdom. So, sacred stewardship, dear ones, is simply this. It is aligning our hearts and lives with God's priorities, with what we do with our whole lives, our time, our talent, and our treasure. And come and share your master's happiness. What God desires is for us to know his joy, to be in his joy. What's at stake here when it comes to our money, what's the battle that's going on with our money is our joy, is our souls. And the same is true for the next generation. What's at stake here, the battle is for the joy of our lives, our souls. And that's what we got to come to grips with, because there's an appalling lack of regifting the next generation on how to faithfully manage their money of sacred stewardship. Just an appalling lack of it. And this is cited as a major hindrance in young adults' lives today, and it's growing. It's cited as a reason for their growing anxiety and depression is because they're confused about how to manage faithfully their lives, their money that God has given them. So you can regift sacred stewardship to the next generation in this way. Teach the next generation to manage their money in a way that aligns their heart and life with the priorities of God. You can regift this. Now, it may mean that you got to learn it first today or in the days to come to get it first yourself, but then you regift it because you can show them. Your life is a sacred stewardship, and this is an amazing gift. It brings joy in what we have instead of anxiety and depression. So, let's get real practical. What are some ways that we can regift sacred stewardship, faithfully managing money to the next generation? The first thing I want to say is this: help them to keep track of what they spend. It seems like a simple thing, doesn't it? And yet, I've talked to too many young adults, when I talk to them about money, they say, well, I just figure at the end of the month, if I have something left in the bank, I'm good. I don't know where it went, but I'm good. And I'm glad. I'm glad it's that way instead of the other. But to really steward those good gifts that God has given us, to use those gifts to the fullness, you got to keep track of it. However it works. Get an app, go on the computer. My wife, who's a master at this, frankly, she could be teaching this sermon a lot better than I. She has for years had just a simple notebook paper, and she gets a ruler out, and she makes lines, and then she just keeps track by hand. And that's what she taught our kids to do. It works fine. Help them to keep track of their money. Because here's the thing. In most of our families, our kids just are given most of what they have. They don't even know about it. In fact, here's what I experienced, what Katie and I experienced. When we had less, younger in our family life, when we had less, it was much easier to help your kids, to teach your kids to manage money. Because if they said, can we have this? And we say no, and they say why, we say, we don't have the money. And they go, oh, okay. You know, and with Nate and Sam, they're our first kids, they call themselves the original family. It worked. Now, when there's 11 years difference between our oldest and youngest. When we got to Emily and especially Carrie, they call themselves the ultimate family. We had more. So I said, can we have this? Like, well, I guess we got it, so let's go. It's a lot harder. And when they're just getting it without knowing how to manage that, we're not helping them at all. So Chip Ingram, the one who's I'm kind of borrowing here, sermons, he realized this in his own family. I think there's 14 years difference between his oldest and youngest. And he realized when his youngest daughter, his youngest child, was a sophomore in high school, he had this, come to Jesus moment where he realized he hadn't really taught her how to faithfully manage her money like he had done previously. And he knew that there needed some shock treatment. And it's not like she was like a spendthrift, and an evil child. She was amazingly faithful. But he just hadn't taught her anything. And he went home and he apologized. He said, forgive me, and we're going to do something now. And what they did, and maybe if you have a student in middle school or high school and you haven't done any of this yet, maybe this is what you need to do. They figured out all the money they spent on her, not including, the food they buy at the grocery store, the mortgage or the utilities, but all the other money, like how much it costs to go to the dance lessons or be on the sports team or go on the trip or go to the movie or get clothes, whatever it is, lunch money, whatever it is. They figured out what that amount is for the year. They divided by 12, and at the beginning of every month, they gave her monthly money and said, here, it's yours. You figure out what to do with it. how to manage it. Kind of a risk, don't you think? Well, she learned to manage it incredibly faithful. She learned what I'm going to say here about giving, saving, and spending so that by the time she graduated from high school, she had $3,000 saved up. Maybe that's what you need to do with your children. After you teach them to keep track of what they're spending, this is what I'm going to suggest, the simple, very practical way to teach your kids to manage money. Give, save, spend. Give, save, spend. If you have elementary kids, go out and get some mason jars. Put this on their dresser and do this. So, in the other services, I had children's sermons, and I brought kids up. Okay? I had 4 kids. I had 4 envelopes. And I said, we're going to imagine that you're being paid for a job. So the first one had 10 dimes in there. So I taught them 1 dime here, 1 dime here, 8 dimes here. Next one had 10 $1 bills. $1 here, $1 here, $8 here. Third one had 10 $10 bills, $100. And they're like, oh, wow. 1 $10 bill here, 1 $10 bill here, 8 here. And there's the 4th one. And both times it was one of the kids was pretty sharp, and they're going. I said, how much is in that envelope? And he goes, $1,000. And there was $1,000. 10 $100 bills. And this last service, I said, what's in there? And this is what she said. She goes, there's 10 Benjamins in here. That's awesome. It's 10 Benjamins. But this simple way of teaching kids to what they do when they get money. Give, save, spend. We give to God first, we give to ourselves, and our future's next, and then we have the rest to live on. Now, why is it this way? Why did God say, give 10%, the tithe? And this is the reason why. We have 100% of our money. I believe that all of us can live on 80%, if not less. But let's say, okay, we have 90%. We've lived on 90%. Maybe we've saved some of that. And then we got this 10% left over. Like, oh, I got this. What could I do? I got this extra. What could I do with this? I know. I'll go buy this, or I'll get this, or I'll go there. And instead of being 10%, it becomes 15 or 20%, and suddenly they're in trouble. I think God gave us this discipline of the tithe in order to help us not get in trouble, for our money not to become a mess. I also think it gives first fruits. It's honoring God first. And it's a sacrifice. Let's face it. You know your money. If you're giving 10%, you're going to say, ooh, that's going to be a sacrifice. I think God owns it all. It needs to be a sacrifice. And not only this, regardless of how much money you have, it'll never be enough. It'll never be enough if you're not doing this. Because you'll look online, you'll see on Facebook, you'll see this, and like, oh, I need this, or I need this, I don't have enough to do this. When we give first to God and God's purposes, there is a joy that comes with that. There's an excitement that says, I am using my money, which is really God's money, but I'm using my money for an eternal purpose. And that brings deep meaning and purpose to a person's life. If we don't teach the next generation to give, we are robbing them. We're robbing them of the joy that they could experience in that. 10, 10, 80. Give, save, spend. It's a way that we can help the next generation in a simple way manage their money well and experience sacred stewardship. Now, you might say, okay, I'm hearing you, Pastor, but I want to tell you, my money is a mess. I need help. If that's where you're at, cry out to God. God, I need help here. And if that's where you're at, I want you to watch this video.